On this episode of Newt's World, the AI company Anthropic created a special model called Claude Gov, the first to be used on classified systems. This model does not have the same guardrails and restrictions that their models available to the public have. On Tuesday, February 24th, Secretary Hegseth met with Dario Amodei, the Anthropic chief executive at the Pentagon, and they could not come to an agreement over Anthropic asking for reasonable assurances that its model would not be used for surveillance of Americans or in autonomous weapons such as drone operations that did not involve human oversight. Anthropic is now suing the Department of Defense and escalating their dispute over the use of artificial intelligence in warfare. I am really pleased to welcome my guest, Michael Horowitz. He is a senior fellow for technology and innovation at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also director of Perry World House and Richard Perry Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Development and Emerging Capabilities and Director of the Emerging Capabilities Policy Office. He is the author of The Diffusion of Military Power, Causes and Consequences for International Politics, and co-author of Why Leaders Fight. Michael, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
I'm delighted that you would take time to be with us, particularly with all the things that are going on right now. You've suggested that the Defense Department is really still approaching military artificial intelligence in kind of an experimentation mode. Why do you think adoption has been slower and more tentative than some people expected?
You're a student of history, and I think it comes straight from there. The United States, we've been privileged that the United States has the world's most powerful military and the world's best soldiers and the world's best technology. And sometimes when you're the best, it's hard to transform because every day the U.S. military is in fact the best, and so change seems risky. And so when it comes to the incorporation of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, I think many people in the Pentagon, both before I served, sort of while I was there, and now recognize the enormous potential that AI has to transform warfare, just like so many other elements of our society. But it's been hard to get senior decision makers to invest the real dollars that you need to scale capabilities across the military.
Why do you think that's true? There's a sort of sticking with the old system, and this is not new. This was also true, for example, the battleship admirals who kept rejecting the idea that aircraft would work from carriers.
Exactly.
What should we as a country do to get a genuinely modernizing Department of War?
I think that we now live in an era that I would call the age of precise mass in war, where the combination of commercial manufacturing, the fact that precision guidance is now 50-year-old technology, and advances in autonomous systems and artificial intelligence mean that now every country and militant group around the world can launch precision strikes in one way or another, and sometimes in large volumes, as we see Iran doing in the Middle East right now. And in that era, the way that the U.S. has thought about setting up its military, I think, needs to change a little bit, and that the United States needs to be a lot more aggressive in incorporating some of these artificial intelligence tools that can help our troops and our senior decision makers make sense of the battlefield, processing information much faster and getting information to the right people at the right time so they can make the correct decisions and help the American military fight and win the nation's wars.
I helped found the Military Reform Caucus in 1981. I was the third witness on behalf of the Goldwater-Nichols bill that profoundly changed the system and moved us towards jointness, in which, by the way, every currently serving active duty force are opposed. They hated the idea of being forced into jointness, and they actually got Reagan and Secretary of Defense Weinberger to oppose it, And we won anyway, because it was so obvious how out of cycle the system was, because during the liberation of Grenada, an army officer had to go to a payphone, use his credit card, call the Pentagon to get a friend to call the Navy to tell them that the Army and Navy radios were not working together.
Unbelievable. I mean, no, it is believable. That's the problem.
What it did was it led to hearings where these 4-stars would come in, explain the system was really working, and then an everyday congressman who might not have been all that sophisticated said, let me get this straight. You think that having to use a credit card at a payphone is a solution? And of course, they had no answers, and they just were totally discredited. So I've been working this problem of how do you modernize defense for a fair length of time. It always involves the building doing everything it can to avoid it. Great speeches, but very timid decisions. When you look at that, and it strikes me that artificial intelligence is both going to have a supportive role in that things like managing inventories, tracking data, there's just 1,000 ways that it's going to dramatically improve and accelerate what we can do. And at the same time, it may well end up having a war-fighting role. So you've got to actually look at both sides of this. How are you using it to dramatically modernize and improve the ongoing systems? But also, how do you potentially have to rethink the whole art of war in what could really become a real-time, astonishingly complex situation? How do you approach that? How do you think about that?
It's a great question. I think that artificial intelligence is really changing the character of warfare. And I would think about 3 different buckets that artificial intelligence falls into for a military like the United States. The first bucket are uses of artificial intelligence for the military that, sort of as you suggested, are exactly like what you would see in a company in the private sector. Uses for, human resources, payroll processing, basic logistics. All of those things where artificial intelligence can speed workflows, simplify things, generate efficiencies, et cetera. So that's bucket 1. Bucket 2 is in what I would call the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance arena. And that is the way that the military is getting all sorts of data from satellites, from human sources, from airborne sensors, from troops on the battlefield, and taking all of that data and trying strategically to understand the capabilities of potential adversaries like China or Russia, and tactically then in the context of a conflict that's happening, figure out, what is actually going on in Iran, or what is actually going on in the Strait of Hormuz. And in that case, the ability of artificial intelligence to process data quickly and to pull out the signal from the noise, faster than a human might be able to, means that it becomes an incredible teammate to help speed up that process of getting more accurate information to commanders. So that's bucket 2. Then bucket 3 is the sort of pointy end of the spear. And that is the use of artificial intelligence as decision support, essentially tools to help commanders make good decisions close to the battlefield, and then potentially the incorporation of artificial intelligence into what are called autonomous weapon systems, which are weapon systems that can select and engage targets themselves after a human activates them. And to be clear, as you know, the military has been using artificial intelligence for decades. And the United States has actually fielded some of these kinds of weapon systems with very, very simple, sort of more primitive types of artificial intelligence since the 1980s. But today, as artificial intelligence tools have become much more powerful, then the prospect for them to really impact the battlefield has become much more powerful as well. But those are the 3 buckets, I think.
When you think about it in those 3 buckets, let me start with the last one you mentioned, the point of the spear. How realistic is it in your mind that you're going to have, for example, one fighter aircraft with 30 or 40 smart drones that are capable of operating autonomously?
I sure hope that happens sooner rather than later. When I was in the Pentagon a couple of years ago, we moved forward and created a new program for the Air Force called Collaborative Combat Aircraft, where the whole idea is that you have an advanced US fighter jet, like say an F-35, surrounded by a series of unmanned aircraft that can operate mostly autonomously, but are controlled by that pilot or by someone in a different aircraft nearby. And that really can amplify the ability of our individual fighter pilots to have impact on the battlefield, because each of those drones then can carry missiles, they can carry sensors. And we are on track to start fielding some of those systems before 2030. So this isn't science fiction anymore. This is becoming reality. And it might be one pilot surrounded by 5 drones to start, not one pilot surrounded by 30 drones. But that's the direction of travel we are moving in.
From that standpoint, does that become truly autonomous? Is there some middle ground here where you still have human engagement interacting with semi-autonomous systems?
So the collaborative combat aircraft that the U.S. Air Force is envisioning right now are what we would call semi-autonomous, and that they have autonomous flight and they can do lots of things autonomously. But when it comes to the use of force, actually, firing a missile, dropping a bomb, there's still that human pilot in, say, the F-35 or in some other airplane that's controlling them is still the one that makes the decision about that. Now, that, of course, raises the question, as technology improves, and sorry, just to be clear about this, the Air Force isn't, or at least I hope not, isn't having the human make the decision because out of principle per se, it's because they think that's the most effective way to use force. And in part, that's because the technology still has a ways to go for something like collaborative combat aircraft before you could have a autonomous weapons release. But one could imagine future increments, future collaborative combat aircraft that the Air Force deploys that would be completely autonomous. And it's just a question of how quickly the technology advances and whether the Air Force can prove that it reliably works. Since you know this better than I do, nobody wants their technology to work more than the military because it's their lives that are on the line.
The battlefield is a very harsh projector of incompetence, and the prices are enormous. So you're exactly right. I think people who've never served or never been close to the military really do not appreciate how harsh it is and how great the pressure is to try to do it right. There are some anti-tank weapons that in fact are relatively autonomous in that they have been programmed to look for tanks. And if they see a tank, they've been programmed to go ahead and kill it. And I think they currently don't do that with any kind of permission from the initial source. I think it's all on board.
That's absolutely right. Those are still, from a very technical Pentagon policy perspective now, those are still called semi-autonomous because a human is firing the individual javelin. But another example is think about radar-guided missiles. Radar-guided missiles have been around for 40 some odd years. And so a pilot in a U.S. fighter aircraft gets a ping that there's an enemy radar. They fire a missile. That missile goes off in the direction that the pilot's fired it. It opens a seeker and it goes for the radar. And what if that radar's on top of a school? What if that radar's on top of a hospital? Like, it doesn't know. Like, it just goes and hits the radar. There's no human supervision on it. That's a system that dozens of militaries around the world have used, I think, since the late 60s, essentially, if you go back to heat-seeking missiles.
In that sense, there's a lot deeper pattern of gradually evolving these systems than people sometimes think. It's not like there's a brand new world that opened up on Tuesday. Explain to me, what is the big fight between the Defense Department and Anthropic?
Whew. A lot of controversy there the last couple of weeks. I think this is a tragedy, and my bottom line up front on that is the winner is China. And let me explain why I get to that conclusion. Anthropic was the first of the big artificial intelligence frontier labs, leading American companies, pushing the edge forward, that was willing to do classified work with the Pentagon. And there's no dispute between the Pentagon and Anthropic about any projects that they are working on together today. There is also no dispute between Anthropic and the Pentagon about any projects the Pentagon has asked Anthropic to work on. It sounds like what happened is after the Maduro operation in January, an Anthropic staffer called up a staffer at a company called Palantir, which operates a sort of dashboard for U.S. military commanders called Maven Smart System. And they called up somebody at Palantir and they said, hey, was our system, Anthropic's system being Claude, used in the Maduro operation. And the Pentagon heard about this and they were upset. They're like, why is Anthropic asking questions about the use of their technology? Of course, we're using their technology responsibly. And this dispute kind of escalates where the Pentagon is essentially talking to Anthropic, thinking about adopting Anthropic's technology the way that you think about acquiring a missile from Lockheed. When Lockheed sells the Pentagon a missile, Lockheed doesn't get to tell the Pentagon, hey, you can only use it against these countries, but not those other countries. And meanwhile, Anthropic was nervous that the Pentagon might be thinking about employing its technology in areas where Anthropic thinks it's not ready and wouldn't be effective. And so you really had essentially a breakdown in trust, I think, on both sides, where the Pentagon didn't trust that Anthropic would be there for important national security use cases. And Anthropic didn't trust that the Pentagon would use its technology responsibly. And this is a tragedy in some ways because Anthropic is already working with the American military. And in fact, Anthropic's technology is supporting our troops in the operation against Iran. I think that this is really about personality and politics in some ways, like masquerading as a policy dispute.
It's almost like you ought to lock some people in a room and tell them, work this out and we'll unlock the door.
It's unbelievable in some ways to me that on Friday at 5:01 p.m., you have announcements from the president and from senior leadership in the Pentagon putting Anthropic essentially on the naughty list from the perspective of the U.S. government. And then the next day, U.S. Central Command in the Middle East is using Anthropic's technology to help, initial hours of the strikes against Iran, which illustrates how useful the actual warfighters think that this technology is. And so you would think that there should be a path to agreement then, where both sides could get along, but they seem really dug in at this point. And I think Anthropic's leadership doesn't want to back down. They don't want to look weak to their workforce. And I think the Pentagon Undersecretary Hegseth is, as I'm sure you've noticed, a little aggressive at times. And so I'm sure also doesn't want to back down. That's a recipe for a disagreement that, at least in my view, isn't needed.
I've been fascinated that there's a churning effect where when you have the kind of fight we're seeing with Anthropic, they pull back, but then all of a sudden you have somebody else jump in. Is it your judgment that this fight will drive people who are good at artificial intelligence away, or that in fact it just creates a vacuum where other players come in because they see it as their advantage?
That's a really good question. OpenAI stepped into the breach here, and I think OpenAI deserves some credit in this context because they were, I think, initially trying to broker a peace, essentially, to come up with an agreement that they could make with the Pentagon that Anthropic would make as well. Since I do think that these technology companies see what the Pentagon has done to Anthropic and labeling them as a supply chain risk, that creates a risk for everyone in some ways. If you have negotiations that go south with the Pentagon and then the Pentagon doesn't just cancel your contract, they also, salt the earth essentially and try to take out your business. I mean, we've seen Microsoft, for example, support Anthropic's lawsuit against the Pentagon, because they're a software company. They have terms of service in their contracts and they want to be able to have terms of service in their contracts with the Pentagon the same way they have for decades. I think OpenAI seems likely to step in. xAI, Elon Musk's company, has said that they're willing to do classified work with the Pentagon, but it's going to take time. Anthropic's technology, its platform Claude, is now built into the operational workflow of how U.S. military commanders around the world are getting information and making decisions. And untangling that is going to be messy. And that's why simultaneously, Anthropic has been labeled a supply chain risk, but the Pentagon has 6 full months to disentangle them, as an illustration, I think, of how useful the actual warfighters think that this technology is.
Well, in 6 months' time, who knows what negotiations will go on behind closed doors?
Is that a 6-month bargaining period, maybe? I would hope so, but we'll see.
Do you think that the evolution, the sheer power of artificial intelligence as it's being developed across an enormous range of companies and entrepreneurs, do you think, despite these occasional glitches, it's almost inevitable that it will permeate the entire Department of War?
The short answer is, in one word, yes. And the reason is that artificial intelligence, to me, is a general purpose technology. And it's not the only general purpose technology in history. We have other general purpose technologies. Think back to the late 19th century and electricity and the combustion engine and the airplane. And it's early 20th century. But the idea being you have these breakthroughs that are not just like a single widget, but are transformational to the economy, to society, and to the military. Think about the way that electricity permeates every area of American society and the economy and everything that's happening in the military in a way that it's ubiquitous. You don't think about there's the impact of electricity in some ways. And I think artificial intelligence is poised to be very similar. And in that way, you would expect that every office in the Pentagon will be using artificial intelligence in one way or another. And there'll be algorithms embedded in every American military platform in the coming decades. And I do think that that is inevitable to some extent. The question is just, do we get there fast enough in a way that preserves America's military edge? And do we do it right in a way that ensures that the technology is effective and keeps us ahead of China, our greatest competitor?
The other thing that's going on is a declining cost. If you look at what, for example, Ukraine now makes drones for, compared to what the Pentagon would make a drone for if left to its own devices, there are staggering crashes and costs coming our way. And that's going to make a lot of mid-size countries more dangerous than they used to be.
It used to be that if you wanted to launch a missile 1,000, 2,000 kilometers, maybe you'd be looking at trying to buy an advanced missile from the United States that maybe costs $1 million per shot or $2 million per shot. This goes back to what I said earlier about us being in this age of precise mass. Look at what the Houthis did in the Red Sea. The Houthis generated, $1 billion in economic damage, essentially firing flying lawnmowers that cost $20,000 a pop, $40,000 a pop at U.S. Navy ships. And our sailors would sometimes fire $1 million missiles to shoot them down. That's not a good cost exchange ratio. And what Ukraine has done is remarkable in the way that they have leveraged these one-way attack drones to hold back the Russian invaders over time. If you want a good news story here, though, one of the things that happened in the context of the Iran operation is the U.S. deployed for the first time a system called the Lucas. It's the low-cost unmanned combat aerial system. And the Lucas is about $35,000 and is reverse engineered from Iran's Shahed 136, which Iran has sold tens of thousands of these to the Russians, and the Russians have built their own version. Well, the U.S. captured a couple of these Iranian Shaheds, reverse engineered them, and then thought, well, hey, maybe we could build these from ourselves. After all, if Russia's using tens of thousands of these a month sometimes, this is a system that's proven to work. And so in the opening hours of the campaign against Iran, the U.S. actually used Iran's own technology against it in the form of this Lucas platform, which is, rather than being a $2 million Tomahawk, is a $35,000 system. The U.S. is starting to get it. It's just been slow.
We had better get to be a lot faster, both in competing with China, but also just random opponents. A lot of these countries are going to be able to buy stuff on the free market or be able to go to their own chat GPT and say, now, how would you build this? And have an amazing amount of information being distributed in virtually real time.
Absolutely. In this period, we're in, any country around the world is now going to be able to have their own, essentially, 1,000-kilometer, 2,000-kilometer strike weapons. They're not going to have to rely just on the United States for that or just on Russia for that, which is a more dangerous world. But it's not like you could stop that with arms control. That'd be like trying to stop water or something. This is an inevitability. This is happening, which means that if you're the United States, then both the United States needs to get on the train, and I'm encouraged by some of the things that I'm seeing now, but it also means then that we need to figure out how to defend against these systems at a much lower cost. We're really lucky to be the wealthiest, most powerful country in the world, but we can't forever shoot down, $20,000, $30,000 things with $1 million defensive missiles. And it's why I was encouraging that the U.S. is now adopting some of the technology that Ukraine has been using to defend against these strikes.
The ability to get to low-cost, massively produced numbers. Lord Nelson in the Napoleonic Wars once said that numbers annihilate. Seems to me that being able to produce at field and use relatively inexpensive weapons is a major key to surviving the battlefield in the next 30 or 40 years.
I think that's absolutely right. The U.S. has been in a position for the last 30 or 40 years where we've relied on increasingly small numbers of really exquisite systems. And that was okay because our systems were the best in the world. Even having small numbers of them was good enough to sort of take on any adversary. But that is going to be increasingly difficult in this era when so many different adversaries are going to have so many more capabilities and increasingly leveraging artificial intelligence. And so in this new era, then, I think the U.S. needs to shift what I would call a high-low mix, where it's not that we need to get rid of our Tomahawk missiles or our fancy systems, but we need to complement those by spending a lot more on some of these low-cost weapons and low-cost sensors that are genuinely no cost, not like gold-plated Pentagon low cost.
Aren't we today actually spending a remarkably tiny amount of money on the kind of weapons you're describing compared to what we spend on very exquisite, complex systems?
When I was in the Pentagon, we tried to move, I think, $500 million at one point to move toward to something called the Replicator Initiative to fund some of these kinds of systems. And it took more than 40 briefings of the appropriations committees in the House and the Senate of really senior leaders, busy senior leaders in the Pentagon, like up to the Deputy Secretary, then Deputy Secretary of Defense, to get that done. And that was so much time to move what essentially was less than 1% of the Pentagon budget. And even today, there's actually a bunch of money that the Trump administration really smartly put into the big, beautiful bill to try to accelerate these capabilities. But even with those, there's about like $5 billion or so there. Even then, we're talking, like 1% of the defense budget, something like that. It's a lot of money to me or you. But for the Pentagon, it's a fraction of what one aircraft carrier costs.
Which then tells you where the attention of the senior leadership is.
Yep. Follow the money.
It's a real problem. Listen, Michael, I want to thank you for joining me. Our listeners can follow the work you're doing at the Council on Foreign Relations by visiting the website at cfr.org. Your book, The Diffusion of Military Power, Causes and Consequences for International Politics, is available on Amazon. And I thought this was a very, very helpful conversation.
Thanks so much for having me, and happy to chat anytime.
Thank you to my guest, Michael Horowitz. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Join me on Substack at Gingrich360.net. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.